Rivalries in sports can have an impact on teams, schools, communities, and athletes, among many other aspects of a sporting event. Rivalries can also have an impact on another group, a group that is often overlooked, the coaches. In this video, we will explore how rivalries have an impact on one coach in particular, Coach Todd Dutton, the varsity basketball coach at Windsor High School. Dutton is a man with more than 15 years of playing experience and 30 plus years of coaching experience at the high school level. Coach Dutton ranks among the most respected coaches in the St. Louis area. Before taking the reins at Windsor, Dutton was head coach at Riverview Gardens for many years. While there, he led the Rams to a 31-1 record and a Class 4A state title in 1992 against Raytown South High School. Having coached in numerous conference championships and district championships against coaches in the Missouri State Hall of Fame and even players in the NBA, Dutton knows quite a bit about rivalries, how they're formed, and especially the way the success can breed them. In order to learn more about Dutton and the way in which he approaches rivalries, my group decided to interview Dutton himself and two of his former players, shooting guard Thomas Keeney of the Windsor class of 2013 and former forward Jimmy West of the class of 2014. We can compare these interviews to find out some different perspectives that may exist between coaches and players leading up to and during rivalry games. Enjoy.
Well, yes and no. Like, the structure of our practices were the same, but when we worked on the things that we were going to contribute to the game, he did approach it differently. So he would lock down on their first or second top scores, and then we would set our defense or our game plan around stopping those scores. So, for example, when we played DeSoto, they had a lights-out shooter, and then they had a pesky guard. So we ran a triangle and two to try to prevent them from touching the ball to make other non-efficient scores try to score the ball more. And then doing that, it backfired sometimes, but it gave us a mindset going in because his mindset was he didn't want their best players to beat us. He wanted the team's weaker players to beat us. So if we lost, it wasn't because their best players scored 20 or 30 points.
All right, Jimmy. Leading up to a conference game or a rivalry game, did Coach Dutton conduct his practices differently?
Most definitely.
That game.
If you have a rival team, and a lot of times I think that game will get the athletes pumped up, somewhat like if it was a championship game or somewhat like it was some other type of big game. So I think you'd want to just, one, you're not going to have to bring the team up as much. That week probably is going to be a more energetic week of practice where you're just going to have to keep the team focused so that that energy doesn't get to be too silly, or so that energy doesn't get them where they're working hard at practice or playing hard, but they're not really thinking. So I think the coach has to kind of use that to his advantage, that they're already pumped up, but make sure that he continues to focus on exactly what he wants the team to do, because you want the team jacked up in the game, but you also want them to stick to the game.
Yes. He was way more aggressive, way more cutthroat against the defense, and we had opportunities. He wanted us to take it more, and he would always tell us that it was like a dogfight out there, and we're going to have to scrap and do whatever we can to win. And he was right, because those games, nothing's given in those games, and you have to take everything you can get. And that's just how it was.
Was his aggressiveness harmful or helpful compared to other games?
I would say more harmful, because, no, I don't want to say that. I want to say it was more beneficial.
Like depending on certain players, maybe?
It was more beneficial because it fired up the troops. And for most games, it was hard to motivate the troops to play as hard as they can, but in the rivalry games, through his intensity, it motivated our players to play better and harder.
All right. See level change during conference or rivalry games, and was it harmful or helpful to the players on his team?
Well, during the practices leading up to the conference games, I would say that the intensity level definitely increased. But actually coaching during the game, I wouldn't say that his intensity level differed at all. More so I would say he was more focused in his coaching during those games. Because we play non-conference opponents, and depending on circumstances, he'd be more intense or not. But he was definitely a lot more focused and more determined to win, I felt like. And the whole team was able to feel it leading up to the conference game, playing the conference game.
Well, yes. I've coached a long time at different schools, and regardless of where I was at, the same thing you want with the team, really, the coach should be saying to himself, as far as just don't get way too pumped up that you're doing extra yelling, and because a coach could have a big impact on if the team is nervous because he's yelling more than he usually does, just because if he's too excited, then he can get your team excited. So I think you always have to keep that in mind too.
He was happy for us and he was proud because although we weren't that successful, all our hard work finally did pay off, and we got to share a moment as a team where we felt like champions. So for a moment, he looked at us as winners, and he was happy to share such a great moment with us and let us feel success. And he was really passionate coach, and I appreciate that because he really did care about our players. And now that looking back and think about it, I do miss him as a person and a coach because he really did care about us.
Honestly, I think in his coaching career, I think if he looked back on it, he might say that was his second greatest moment coaching, just from the pure happiness. But besides from him winning a state championship, that's probably his second favorite moment as a coach. You could just tell he went nuts. He threw all his stuff into the air, just ran onto the floor, hugged Keeney for a second, and then he just got lost in the crowd.
Do you
Having a good time.
Do you think that game meant more to him because of all the losing that he had to endure first, losing all those games?
It definitely made it sweeter. I don't know if that's what made it mean the most, but it definitely made it a sweeter victory that the team had trouble with wins.
Please let it go in. Please let it go in, because as much as it was a rivalry game, to win a conference game, first of all, we have a small conference. You're only talking about 4 games. So, and something I probably didn't know was that Festus is pretty good, Hillsboro's pretty good, Perryville's pretty good, and then DeSoto is pretty good. So, it's like, who's the weak one in the conference? There isn't one. So it was always a challenge coming here. And once I found out that, man, these teams are pretty good that are in our conference, how are we going to beat them, and are we ever going to beat them? So that was a really big game. I know it was a rivalry game. It was something that's really important here. It's a senior night. People really get into that. We had a huge crowd. Everybody was waiting for us to finally win a home game. And so not just a rivalry, but also a real every one of those conference games was a challenge for us to actually beat one of the teams. And it was just great to pull it off there. We had been so close with beating DeSoto. We could have beat them twice, but we lost by 1 point each time, or 1 and 2.
I think we lost by 4 points the entire year, like 3 games.
Yeah. So it was a big game, a big shot, and it just was a lot of relief that we finally had won, and hopefully can win some more. Other good coaches. So I never was a fan of Florida Irons, but I can't say he was a crappy coach, because he wasn't. And Terry Hollander at St. Charles West, we always had a big rivalry against. And after the game, we talked like we were old buddies, but during the game, I didn't like him. And I know he didn't like me, because he'd be hollering at me, we'd be hollering at each other. Oh, your player's fouling them, that type of thing. But it's fun. That's what makes sports, a good time.